Okay, so I actually want to start with this topic because it's very relevant to the theme of tonight and tomorrow. As many of you may know, tonight and tomorrow across the world is Yom HaShoah, which is the Holocaust Day, instituted by the State of Israel some 75 years ago, in order to remember and never forget what happened from 1939 to 1945, as the Second World War was launched by Adolf Hitler in Machshemo and Germany, and was conquering country after country in Europe. Jews were being slaughtered. They made it no secret that one of their main goals, one of the Nazis' main goals, was the final solution. And in fact, they had sent Adolf Eichmann as the special emissary to count how many Jews there were in Europe, so that they know how many Jews they would have to murder. And in the Wannsee Conference in 1940, as many of you may be familiar with, Adolf Eichmann presented this document that still exists in a building in Wannsee, in which he counted that there were about 11 million Jews living in Europe at the time, or not just Europe, but Asia, if you count Russia as Europe. And they set it a goal to murder all of these Jews. It was just unheard of. But they were unfortunately quite successful at achieving that goal. As we know, 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. In fact, there's a French professor today that puts that number at 7.5 million Jews. 6 million, he says, is really not the correct number. And we came out, world Jewry came out of the Holocaust in 1945 with every family having been affected, every Jewish family having been affected by the Holocaust. Every family had either a relative or at least a friend that was murdered in the Holocaust. A third of the Jewish nation was murdered in the Holocaust about 80 years ago. And the State of Israel, therefore, decided to institute this Yom HaShoah, which again begins today and continues on till tomorrow evening, in order to remember this horrific period in Jewish history, and at the same time also to learn from it and to share the message of never again to the world around us. That's the idea of Yom HaShoah. But I want to focus on one particular lesson that I think we should all focus on as we commemorate the 6 or 7.5 million, as mentioned, and this maybe the darkest era in Jewish history. And that is really a lesson that we learn not necessarily from the Holocaust itself, but from the post-Holocaust era that was paved and led by the Holocaust survivors themselves. What fascinates me, and surely many of you, is that these Holocaust survivors came out after the entire world has been decimated. Families were wiped out. They came out alone in the world with the greatest determination and resilience that the world has ever seen, in order to rebuild themselves and dedicate themselves to their future without even once looking at their past. They never fell into the trap of victimhood, and instead they decided to be in the driver's seat and create their own destiny, even though they had suffered so much, even though they were bruised so profoundly. It's astounding to me, and I think it's a lesson that we have to take to heart, because we each suffer, each in our own way. Some suffer great suffering, some less. But what they showed us by never looking back and always facing forward and dedicating themselves to building and building, because they knew that the only answer to destruction is construction. That lesson in of itself, I think, speaks volumes, especially to our day and age, or to our generation, that is so engrossed in victimhood, that is so engrossed in feelings, so engrossed in having feelings determine your actions, instead of the opposite, have your actions determine your feelings. You know, I can think of many Holocaust survivors, but maybe none more famous than Elie Wiesel. The famed Holocaust survivor, was also a Nobel Prize winner in 1986, I think it was. But Elie Wiesel told the story of, maybe it's a story that symbolizes just that, told the story of how he was once lecturing, I think it was in Maryland, and there was a woman, maybe I shared the story in the past, but a woman who stood up in the middle of the lecture, and she told Elie Wiesel, "Oh, you just said that you were in Buchenwald, one of the concentration camps, My father was also in Buchenwald. Maybe you know my father. Elie Wiesel said to this woman, well, who was your father? She said his name, and Elie Wiesel became pale. He said, your father? Of course I knew your father. I have to speak to you after this lecture. After the lecture, they sat in the corner of the room, and Elie Wiesel told this woman, let me tell you who your father was. It was no secret, he tells this woman, that many of us in the concentration camps had cyanide pills. Just in case the torture would be too big, we knew that we could put an end to our lives and an end to all of our suffering just through that cyanide pill. I too had a cyanide pill, he tells this woman. And I decided one day, after a terrible day that I suffered with torture that was becoming just unbearable, to put an end to my life. And that day or that night, late at night, I went to my hiding place and was reaching out for the cyanide pill in my barrack. And all of a sudden, he tells this woman, I hear your father singing. I turn back and I see him singing. And I asked him, how can you be singing in such an evil place? And the man says, how can you not be singing in such an evil place? Elie Wiesel says, I don't understand. They robbed us of everything. They took everything from us. How can you be singing? And the man says, that's exactly my point. They took our families from us. They took our possessions from us. They even took our health from us. But there's one thing they'll never be able to take. And that's our song, song of our heart. So how can I not be singing? Elie Wiesel, again, was about to commit suicide. Heard that response. He was so moved. He said to this woman's father, wow, can I sing with you? And he says to Elie Wiesel, of course you could. And that night they sang together all night long. At the crack of dawn, Elie Wiesel tells the story. He took upon himself never to touch that cyanide pill, but rather to continue to sing and sing and sing the song of his heart to eternity. And we know Elie Wiesel sang that song with tremendous resilience and determination and conviction for the rest of his life. And that song inspired thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Jews and non-Jews alike across the world. But that, in my eyes at least, really is the message we should take from Yom HaShoah. The idea that when suffering happens, we don't look back at it. Rather, we look towards the future, towards answering destruction with construction, towards answering the robbing of maybe everything from us with the song of our heart that we must sing regardless of the pain that we may be enduring. That is what every single Holocaust survivor did. Maybe that also explains why many of them didn't want to speak about their terrible suffering, because they came out of the Holocaust determined to rebuild themselves. And it's almost what Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, said to the entire nation shortly after he became the president of the State of Israel in 1948. Remember, this was just 3 years after the Holocaust. He faced the Jewish world saying that now that Hitler had murdered a third of the Jewish people, it's up to each and every Jew to be a third more Jewish, to make up for the third that was lost. And in a way, that approach was embodied by all the Holocaust survivors. They wanted to do more, not do less, even though they could have had all of the excuses to do less and to just retreat into oblivion or into depression. But instead, they said, we have to be a third more Jewish. We have to do more. We have to focus on building, focus on action. And that in of itself will bring us comfort. It reminds me of the great story of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's a great story, but it's also a tragic story. In 1957, there was a terrible terrorist attack in a place called Kfar Chabad, which is a village of Chabad families just outside of Ben Gurion. We all land in Ben Gurion when we go to Israel, so not too far away from there. In Kfar Chabad, there was a terrorist attack in 1957 in which terrorists came and murdered teachers and students. And the heads of the village were devastated. They thought of closing the village. And they asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory for guidance. And he sent them a telegram. Remember the telegrams? Well, he sent them a telegram. And in that telegram, there were only 3 words. And the 3 words was a loud message to those villagers who had just experienced a terrible terrorist attack. The three words were as follows: Behemshech abinyan titnachamu, which means that by continuing to build, you will find comfort. By continuing to build, you will find comfort. That was the approach. Lubavitcher Rebbe himself, by the way, had a brother who was killed by the Nazis. He escaped the wrath of Nazism the very last second, but much of his family was decimated by the Nazis. So he knew when he spoke those words. But that was the approach. They find comfort, and certainly they found strength by continuing to build themselves, even though everything had been destroyed. Everything in their lives had been destroyed. And I think it's, again, a great message for our generation, because we're so much into feelings and feelings. I'm not in the mood today, so I won't do this. I'm too lazy today, so I won't do this. We define ourselves by our feelings. It's just terrible. Rather than focusing on action. I can tell you, as a rabbi, I've been to enough funerals to know that all eulogies share one thing in common. And that is that the eulogies do not speak about the feelings of the deceased, how he felt, what mood they were in. No one speaks about the feelings of the deceased. You know what they speak about? The deceased actions, what they did. Because in Judaism, we believe what is the truth. And that is that you are what you do. Your deeds will define you much more than your feelings. Holocaust survivors knew that. They faced unfathomable suffering, something that we can't even imagine these days. But they knew that the only answer was just do it, as Nike says. Just do it. Continue to focus on your deeds, not on your feelings. Now you can say, it's one of the tragic things about our day and age that is so advanced in science. On the other hand, I think we take it too far sometimes, because take a Holocaust survivor coming out of the Holocaust in 1945. And I'm not bashing, God forbid, any scientific field. I think every scientific field has its own right, not just to exist, but to share its message with the world. But take a Holocaust survivor in 1945 and give him the psychological tools that we have today, or put him in the world that's almost closed the gap between 1945, and 2022. And let's say that the next year after 1945 is 2022. Now you take a Holocaust survivor that comes out of 1945 into 2022. If we did close that gap, theoretically, you know what would happen? We would tell the Holocaust survivor, whoa. You're suffering from PTSD. You have depression, anxieties. You need medication. You need to go maybe even to rehab for a good 45 days. You need this, you need that. And you would have completely turned that person into whatever it is. Now, this is not a verdict for the world of psychology. I think medication is very much needed sometimes. And I think psychologists and psychotherapists and psychiatrists have a tremendous say and have a tremendous space in the world of medicine altogether. And they are crucially needed. But I'm just saying that sometimes we go overboard with those treatments. And the Holocaust survivors here taught us they did suffer from PTSD, yes. Many of them suffered throughout their entire lives and never got over it. But on the other hand, they rebuilt their lives like no other person could have rebuilt their lives. They were dedicated to just doing it, to deed and deed and deed, even though they had suffered so much, and it paved the way for us today to be who we are today, to be where we are today. And there's a lot to learn from that approach. And again, the best approach to destruction is construction. That's been the Jewish way forever and ever. Every time we faced a tragedy in Judaism, we responded with a burst of construction, of growth, like the Jewish world had never seen before. The Holocaust survivors showed us that with their own hands, with their own model. And it's something that I think we have to learn from them, especially on this Holocaust day. Again, to use the words of Chaim Weizmann, now that Hitler had murdered a third of the Jewish nation, we each have to be a third more Jewish with deed, because nothing will define us more than deed. And I would therefore also make a little appeal for yet another mitzvah. If there's a mitzvah that you are trying to do that you haven't done yet, or mitzvah that you've dreamt of doing and you're not doing yet, then do it today in loving memory of these 6 or 7 or 7.5 million Jews. Because that's the way they dealt with their tragedy. So it should be the way we deal with their tragedy, especially on this Holocaust Remembrance Day, on this Yom HaShoah. Let's answer destruction with construction via mitzvahs, via good actions, via deeds of kindness. And I think that will be the best response to all of those evil people who tried to destroy us. And thank God we're not successful. Anyhow, so that's my just 2 cents on Yom HaShoah. Yes, Janet, and then we can go to the other topics. But go ahead, please.
I have a question. When you say to be a third more Jewish, as in a third of the Jews were killed,
right?
And Orthodox families that have many children, to bring more children into the world for the fact that we've lost so many. Was that something that Orthodox families did prior to the Holocaust? Big families?
Yeah, definitely, yes. But I will tell you that it was no doubt a big boost of motivation after the Holocaust. That the rebuilding the Jewish world certainly gave them a lot of motivation to continue to create more and more children.
Right, which makes sense. Yes. No. Okay.
But it did exist before the Holocaust. Yes, I mean, people came from large families. I'm sure many of you can look back at your great-grandparents and grandparents and great-great-grandparents and see that they did come from relatively large families.
Right, which is great.
Yeah.
And also, it just a comment. It's so sad that the survivors, are disappearing, and the real stories that come right from the survivors' mouths. Of course, we have history and there's books and everything, but it's just kind of so sad that, because there clearly are people who don't believe, and it's just how can we kind of keep it going without having an actual survivor to talk about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's really, 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 really painful to watch this generation of heroes just disappearing physically, at least. But I think that enhances even more our duty to be a third more Jewish, like we were saying, especially that these Holocaust survivors don't have that voice anymore to announce to the world what they experienced and to share with the world their unique message. So we have to take it upon ourselves to do it instead of them, to become the voice to the voiceless, as they say.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you. Good point. Yeah. Okay, let's continue just with the other topics we have here. Okay, this is a topic relating to addictions, but in a very unique way. It's an interesting question. I'm gonna read out the question here. Can people become addicted to being Jewish? I know this sounds strange, but you can become addicted and not want to do anything else but study Torah all day and night. I know of young people that their parents support them until this day because of this addiction. So can people become addicted to being Jewish? That's the question. Or I think the questions, can people become addicted to studying Torah all day and night? Not to being Jewish. I think they fine-tune, the person you fine-tune the question, and really the question is, can people become addicted to studying Torah all day and night? That it becomes almost like an addiction. What's an addiction? A self-destructive behavior that becomes self-destructive, that you forget to feed your own family, which is hinted to in this question, that you forget to live life and become a doer, like we were speaking about before. Can people become addicted to such a thing? It's a good question. Because it evokes really what the sages warn us against. And that is that the whole purpose of the Torah, even the whole purpose of being Jewish, is to be a light unto the nations, The whole purpose of the Torah is to bring healing to the world. The whole purpose of mitzvahs is to better our world with good deeds. Now, if we use Torah, if we use mitzvahs just to benefit ourselves, if God gave me a light and I only keep it in my own closet, then it's the greatest disservice I can do, not just to God, but to myself too. That was sent as an agent. It's almost like an ambassador being sent by a government, whether it's the US government or the Israeli government or the British government. If the British government decided to send their own ambassador to China or to Nigeria, it doesn't matter where, to send an ambassador to a different country, and that ambassador rather stays in Great Britain, doesn't care about his mission, all he does is he stays with his British circles and has no mingling whatsoever with the people of the country that he's supposed to be serving, then he does a great disservice to his country and to himself. We were sent to this world to be ambassadors, to be God's ambassadors. If all we do is take all the gifts that God gives us just to serve ourselves, then I don't know if there's a word for it. Stealing maybe is a word for it. You steal God's gifts to keep for yourself when those gifts are supposed to be for the world. Maybe that's an extreme way of putting it, but an accurate way of putting it. So can people become addicted to studying Torah? In a way, yes, it's a type of addiction, because addiction at the end of the day are self-oriented. Even though they destroy the self, they're still self-oriented. And in Judaism, we are told to be other-oriented. And that's the whole purpose of Torah mitzvahs. Now, I understand people who study Torah for years and years, but eventually they become great scholars for the world. And then they share their knowledge with the entire world. Fine, you can do that if it's a means to the goal. But if it's a goal in and of itself, then we have a problem. Then Houston, we have a problem. And unfortunately, yes, it does exist. I see it in the Jewish world. I see it in other worlds too. It does exist. But I think the message for each and every one of us is that, to put it as practically as possible, is that we can't go to sleep at night before asking ourselves, have I done something as God's ambassador in the world for someone else today? Was my day all about me? Or did I do something for someone else selflessly, just because I'm God's ambassador in this world today? And if the answer is no, I haven't done anything yet, then don't go to sleep until you do that something. And by the way, today it's very easy to do that something selflessly for someone else, because you can just go online and make a donation if that's your thing. Or you can just pick up the phone, it's your cell phone. You don't even have to walk to the home phone anymore, because your cell phone is next to you all the time, or it's on you, even worse. And pick up the phone and say a good word to someone, or repair a broken relationship. It's easy to do that today. But we cannot go to sleep at night until we've become that ambassador. We've acted as that ambassador at least once during the day. That's the purpose of our creation. And if we only care about ourselves and day after day, it's all about me, 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 then yes, it's a type of addiction. That type of addiction that you're referring to. So it's a good question. It's something that really should teach us to be more and more other-oriented, especially in our selfie generation. Okay, that's that question. This question is somehow related, but I'm going to go to the next question. And that is a question about this phrase that was coined by Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who was the foremost Kabbalist in the 16th century, one of the foremost Kabbalists in Jewish history. Rabbi Yitzchak Luria asked each and every one of us to open up our day with the following phrase, Hareini mekabel alai mitzvat aseh shel ve'ahavta l'ra'acha kamocha, which means I take upon myself the biblical mitzvah of loving my fellow as myself. Every single day we should start with that phrase. Many prayer books have actually published that phrase at the opening of the Siddur, because we should start our day with, again, exclaiming that we take upon myself to fulfill the biblical mitzvah of loving my fellow as myself. So the question is on this statement by the Arizal that we should say, by Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, that we should say each and every day. So what is a good translation for this phrase? Is there a Kabbalistic meaning? What does this mean in general, as a collective view and specifically in our personal everyday lives? Is this only meant for fellow Jews? What if we personally don't like someone? I know the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory had a campaign to instill this phrase in young students, and had small signs made for the sitters. Why don't we say this before we begin every single day, or before we begin every Torah class? It is also a suggestion. Is this where the golden rule comes from? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If so, how did the golden rule get associated with other religions as if it was their original idea? Okay, so many questions on the same topic of, again, taking upon ourselves each and every day to love a fellow as ourselves. So first of all, it is published in many of the prayer books as mentioned. And I think that it is a golden rule, like you well put it, in Judaism. In fact, Rabbi Akiva, the famous Mishnaic sage who lived during perilous times, during the destruction of the Second Temple in Israel, he is the one who said that this is the golden rule of the Torah. This is the greatest rule of the Torah. Hillel, the elder who lived about 100 years before him, said that to a convert who wanted to convert on one foot, he said to a convert, you know what, don't do others what you do not want others to do to you. And that's the main principle of the Torah. The rest go unknown. But echoing that verse in a negative way, but still echoing the message of it, that is that you have to love others, at least by starting not to do to them what you don't want others to do to you. So it is a golden rule. You're right by using that term. Now, to answer the other questions that are associated here, what if we personally don't like someone? So for that, I think we have to go to the Tanya, one of the foremost books on Jewish philosophy, one of my favorite books, no doubt, on Jewish psychology and philosophy. But the Tanya in chapter 32 speaks on how to achieve this, because it's true, sometimes we don't like someone. So what, are we fooling ourselves by saying that I'm going to love you? And the Tanya makes a very, very important distinction between the body and the soul. By default, our bodies are different. Even identical twins are not the same. But when we speak about bodies, we're not just speaking about bodies, we're also speaking about that which affects the body, the brains, for example, or the emotions. They also come from the brain. And the persona of people, the personalities of people. We are each different. In the words of the Talmud, just like our faces are different, so too our minds are different. But that's one bucket. The bodies, the minds, the psychology, the personalities of people, we're all different. But then there's another bucket, the deeper bucket. And that's the bucket of the soul. From a soul perspective, we're all equal. Every single one of us is equal, completely equal, the same. Why so? Because the soul is divine, is a piece of God himself. And that piece of God that I have in me is the exact same piece of God that you have in you. Now, with the unity of the Jewish people together, all people together, we can really unite all pieces of God in a way to recreate God's presence in this world. But how do you come to love someone that you don't love or that you don't like? Don't focus on bucket one, focus on bucket two. Focus on the inner divinity. Don't focus on their minds and their psychology and their personalities and their bodies. Focus on bucket two. That you have in common. That not only do you have in common, you're one with that person. There's a divine soul in every single human being. And that's the only way we can truly come to love a person. By loving their inner making, their bucket two, so to speak. They're loving their soul because they have what you have. And if you despise them, you're despising yourself. Now I'm just going to go deeper, and Linda, I know your hand is up. But I just want to give. I know we're speaking abstract, so it's important to be clear and as practical even as possible. But I would again retreat to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson of blessed memory, who would very often, who had that perspective, he would look directly at your soul. He wouldn't care about the body and the minds, etc. Look directly at your soul. And by the way, I think that's how you changed lives, because when you trigger the soul, you have to respond. And that's how people felt like they were being pulled out of the depths of agony and depression when they met him, because he would look at your soul and make you feel like $1 million or even more. He saw your soul, and then by him seeing your soul, you saw it yourself too. But one day a woman came to him and said to the Rebbe, look, I don't understand. You stand for hours and hours and hours giving out dollars to everyone, which he would do each and every Sunday. He would give dollars for people to give those dollars to charity. And at the same time, he would bless them with the blessings that they needed. And this old woman came to him and said, look, I don't understand, Rebbe. We're more or less, we have the same age, more or less. And I couldn't do this. You stand sometimes for 8 hours straight, for 9 hours straight, without taking a break. And was speaking to people. And, you know, it's also emotionally draining, because you try and walk into their shoes. So you do that for 8 hours straight, 9, and you don't get tired. How do you do that? And the Rebbe responded, well, when you count diamonds, you don't get tired. I'm counting diamonds. And that's what the Rebbe saw. He saw diamonds. Now, what do you mean by that? He saw the divine soul. He saw bucket too. Now, yes, sometimes you have people with all sorts of annoyances, but look at their diamond. Look at their divine soul. And in a way, maybe it's your duty to spark that divine soul, to believe in these people, even though they stop believing in themselves, to believe in their divinity and the infinite power of the divinity, even though they may not see it. That's how you come really to love people.